Welcome to Journalist Roundtable. I'm Corey Clark in Philadelphia. And joining us remotely are Christen Smith from the Center Square, Julia Terruso from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Katie Meyer from Spotlight, PA. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Katie, let's start with you. The budget impasse is sort of the big issue this week, as it has been for the last several weeks. You wrote about the impact that it's having on county governments.
Yeah, county governments and a slew of other sort of entities that provide a ton of services across the state. So basically, when the state doesn't have a budget, there are a lot of payments that continue on, such as payments to state employees, salaries, things like that. But there's also a lot of payments that stop. The big ones are schools. That's a huge deal. Payments to counties, which administer a ton of frontline services for things like mental health, foster cares for children, a lot of other like drug and alcohol treatments. And then to nonprofits, there's a ton of different nonprofits across the state. Some are paid through counties, some are paid directly by the state, things like domestic violence shelters. And then there's a lot of state contractors that also don't get paid. So it's a really, really wide swath of entities, of people who are affected by this. But the effect is pretty defined and the same for everybody, which is just that like they have limited options. They can either cut back staff, cut back programming, dip into their reserves, or take out lines of credit, which means taking on debt. All of that affects, the people they serve and also affects their bottom lines way down the road. So you'll see effects from this for probably years.
And there is certainly impact from the fact that we have the federal shutdown happening at the same time. So now that flow of money is gone. And that was mentioned a few times yesterday when state lawmakers were all chiming in on the fact that we're 100 days late on our budget. And speaking of the loans, the Senate and the House obviously had very different ideas about how to move forward here. The Senate decided that they were going to approve no interest loans for certain agencies, including counties, in order to help them get through this impasse for as long as it goes on. In the House, they were very resistant to that. So we wouldn't need that legislation if we could just agree on a budget. And that's why they came back with a roughly $50 billion budget plan to send back to the Senate that they say is necessary because flat funding isn't going to work in a situation where we have rising costs, especially for programs like Medicaid.
Yeah, and to Kristen's point, I think I talked to some people who said this is the first time in recent history that a federal government shutdown has overlapped with a state budget impasse. I think in addition to everything she and Katie just mentioned, it's just a real hit for trust in government. Shutdowns tend to really dampen people's already kind of cynical views of if lawmakers and their government is working for them.
Yes, Julia, you wrote about what a political scientist called a double whammy, right? Is this just a sign of the times?
Well, I think there have been some state lawmakers, or at least one Republican lawmaker, who said, this might become an annual thing in Harrisburg, in a closely divided state. Pennsylvania gets a lot of attention during elections for being this swing state where votes, feel like they matter so much. But then the flip side of that is when you're in a divided state, it's hard to come to a consensus. And obviously, the federal government, we've seen this happening more and more. So it could become a pattern.
It's certainly been a pattern since Shapiro took office, but of course that also aligns with the fact that we've had a really narrowly divided House by about one member or so, and then the Senate Republicans who really view themselves as the stopgap against what they consider Shapiro's policies that they believe would be far more aligned with the progressive wing of, say, House Democrats. And whether that's true or not it's up for discussion. But this pattern seems to be holding steady, and Shapiro has at least another year in office to see where next year's budget goes. But there's already concern, I know, from Representative Jordan Harris, who chairs the Appropriations Committee in the House. He is already saying that a lot of the issues that were sticking points early on in this budget process, particularly mass transit funding, have been kicked down the road again so that we could be in the same exact place a year from now, 18 months from now. There really is concern among them that there's no end in sight with this pattern.
Christen, that "we are the stopgap" quote came from an article you wrote where I guess Pennsylvania came up in the New Jersey governor's race, where they were giving Governor Shapiro some credit for being able to bring things together, but Republican lawmakers said, wait a second, not so fast.
They do, as is often the case with virtually every issue that Shapiro and Senate Republicans disagree upon. It's either one wants to take credit for the good side of the argument, or they want to displace blame. In this case, Senate Republicans are saying he only seems moderate because we make him come to the table and agree with us and meet us halfway on certain policies, such as business tax reductions, such as energy policy, although that is a huge sticking point right now where Senate Republicans would argue they see complete opposite of Shapiro. But it's interesting because in New Jersey, they're looking east to Pennsylvania as a state to emulate because we do have this environment, this business environment and energy environment, but that they think is far superior to what they have going on. And then Shapiro himself turns his eyes to Ohio and says, let's stop losing to quote unquote friggin' Ohio, and really wants to emulate what they have going on there. So it's just a really funny juxtaposition when you look at it from that angle.
Any other takeaways from the dueling Republican and Democratic House press conferences that they had with the 100 days of budget impasse?
I can just say, I mean, again, we're 100 days into this now. There is very little sign of any movement. We did see the House pass a budget that lowered their sort of spending ask again. We're now $50.25 billion for the total spend. That's like 5% higher than last year's. As Christen said, the major things that they're increasing spending for at this point are Medicaid, some of which is statutorily required, and education. Pennsylvania is under a court-ordered obligation to increase funding to public education. We were told our education funding system was unconstitutional because it was so inequitable across the state. So anyway, they're saying this is the baseline. This is like as far down as we can go, essentially, at this point. They have proposed ones that go even further in terms of cutting spending. But the big issue right now, honestly, is that Republicans are now committed to this idea of flat funding. They say we need to just pass a budget to release funding, and then we can talk about these increases that you want. Democrats say that's crazy. You're never going to pass the increases that we want if you flat fund the budget now and release this spending, so we can't do that. And so that's kind of where it is. And they are extremely dug in. We've been talking about the politics of this, and I do think that's a huge factor here. Shapiro is going to be up for re-election next year. He's running against the state treasurer, who is the person who initiated this idea of low or no interest loans going out to some of the people who are missing payments during this impasse. I should say that, the size of the program that Stacey Garrity, who's the treasurer, who's running against Shapiro, the size of the program she's been able to put together it would only cover a fraction of the payments that have been missed. It wouldn't be a huge dent in the missed payments, but again, that's another political wedge. And so you can't help but see politics in this. Certainly, I've never seen a budget, and I've been covering budgets in Pennsylvania for almost 10 years. I've never seen a budget where they seem so intractably divided on like such a basic thing, whether we should increase funding from last year or not. So, when you talk to lobbyists around the building, it doesn't look great. They say, this could go on for quite some time more.
Julia, there seems to be less of a sense of urgency as there has been in the past. Or is that just a perception?
I think it depends who you talk to. I also think, the fact that there's also now a federal government shutdown, there's competing attention for these dual impasses, even though there are a lot of similarities. I mean, Republicans and Democrats in Congress right now are really dug in on both of their sides, and Republicans just want the clean government funding bill passed, and they want to talk about healthcare later. And Democrats are saying, we don't trust that you're going to deliver on that, and we want these two to be part and parcel together. So I think that might be part of why it doesn't feel urgent, is kind of some of those national headlines gobbling things up on the federal front, even though that's only 8 days in. But if you're somebody who relies on funding streams from one or both of the state and federal government, I'm sure it's a pretty urgent matter.
Right. And Katie, the big issue, I think that a lot of people thought the big issue was transit funding, and that was sort of solved. Well, not solved, but at least stopgap. And they still can't come together.
It's funny how that happens, isn't it? Josh Shapiro sort of made the call to take that off the table. He was able to flex some more funding. And he'll basically use long-term project funding to cover daily expenses for SEPTA, for Pittsburgh's transit system. And that did not solve the problem, to be very clear, but it has sort of resolved it, taken it off the table for this year. Shapiro says he's not going to negotiate on that again. And I think, what I've heard from many Democrats is they feel like the goalposts keep moving from Republicans, where now the ask from the GOP is, we want this flat funding situation, which again, Democrats have never really been open to. They say we need to increase funding for Medicaid, for education. Those again are the two big things. So it remains intractable. And again, I think that's sort of an unsatisfying answer to people, right? Where they're just like, isn't there something where somebody can move the needle? And just as of now, when you talk to folks in the building, there's very little. Democrats have said that they would compromise on school choice, which is a big thing for Republicans. We don't know exactly what that compromise would look like. They say they've already compromised on spending. They need some compromises from the Senate. And we don't know what the Senate would be willing to compromise on, because, again, they keep talking about flat funding.
And it's interesting you bring up intractable too, because it's almost, if you look at some of the other policies that are tied into this budget deal, it's almost as if the Senate has slipped backwards, particularly when it comes to raising revenues that could help get to the number that Democrats want to spend. Skill game regulation is a big one. Senate Republicans really champion that. Now they can't even get the votes together to agree on a plan. Then there was also the idea to legalize recreational marijuana for adult use. That is a little less popular, but still there was a plan from the House that was sent over. Republicans said they didn't like it because of the control that it gave to the state to run the system. But then they also never really agreed. They didn't come to the table to negotiate on it either. So now the supposed revenue sources, one of which they really back, are off the table. And as Katie said, it's now flat funding or nothing for now. And in fact, in the House, Seth Grove, who is very budget conscious and worried about our future deficit, even he said we should just pass a 6-month measure and then come back in 2 weeks and figure out the rest, or start negotiating on the rest, so that we're not holding people hostage. But as you can imagine, that waiting another few weeks to figure something out sounds like a horrible idea for the people who actually need the money.
And Christen, the idea of using the rainy day fund is also an issue, but it doesn't seem like that they can come to an agreement on that either. No,
there is always a disagreement about our rainy day fund, which is essentially our emergency savings account. We have a reserve account. Democrats and Republicans view those pots of money differently, and they also view their uses differently. Republicans have long held that not only it's irresponsible to use it to cover ongoing expenses, but that there is state law that says that they can't do it unless certain conditions are met, which is a 2/3 majority from the from the state legislature supporting it, which has obviously not happened. Although they have agreed to use the rainy day fund for things in the past, they've really worked hard on building it up, particularly since Treasurer Garrity came into office. Her measurement for whether our rainy day fund is healthy is how many days of government could be sustained in the event of some sort of economic despair that would reduce revenues drastically. Not a shutdown, but an economic situation. COVID-19 would have been a great example of that. So it's gone from having less than $300 million in it, which would equate to 2.5 days of spending, to now more than 7 billion, which brings it up into the 45 day. So that's a big accomplishment for them, and they're really holding tight to it. They do not want to let that go. But at the same time, Governor Shapiro and the Democrats are saying, but we have these reserve funds that we can use, that we should be spending on education and other taxpayer programs, because what are we doing holding on to it? They gave this money to us, we should spend it on them.
Yeah, and I'll just add, again, to kind of get at the fundamental budget issues here. Along with the rainy day fund, we do have cash reserves that are just in the general budget fund. So together, those are around $11 billion. Democrats point to that and they say, this is money we can and should use. As Christen said, we have gone through periods in the state where we've had very little cash reserve, and that's led to some really difficult budgets. But a lot of that was built up during the pandemic when we were getting federal stimulus money. That really changed the financial game. But we still have what's called a structural deficit in Pennsylvania. We spend more than we make most years unless there is some sort of cash influx. And so that's where you sort of see these fundamental disagreements about how fiscally healthy we are. And again, Democrats really do say, like, we need to be using some of this. We can't hold on to it forever. Republicans disagree. And you get, as I think the word of the day, like intractable, you get more and more intractable disagreements over what to do.
Julia, let's talk about the elections, and we'll talk about actually next year, because the 3rd district, congressional district around Philadelphia, in Northwest Philadelphia, is becoming very crowded, and most recently, a sort of political outsider, Ayla Stanford, joined the race and was backed by the incumbent, right?
Yeah, so this is going to be, it looks like a crowded and exciting primary in Philadelphia. I think there's like about 4 competitive general election congressional races that we'll see next year. Some of those do have primaries, but this 3rd district, represented by Congressman Dwight Evans, is the most Democratic district in the entire state. So it's a really coveted seat for Democrats in Philadelphia who want to serve in Congress and maybe serve there for a very long time. Congressman Evans has been there since 2016. He announced his retirement after having some health issues. And I think it was a little bit unexpected that somewhat early in the race, he endorsed Ayla Stanford, who is a surgeon who got really involved in Philadelphia during the COVID-19 pandemic. She founded the Black Doctors Consortium, which was getting vaccines out into low-income neighborhoods, and as we saw, the rates of Black Americans getting vaccines was lower. She did a lot to build trust in those communities, and I think there's a statistic that she helped vaccinate like 10,000 Philadelphians or something. So even though she's a political outsider, I do think she's somewhat known in the city, and Congressman Evans' endorsement of her was interesting because there are 3 lawmakers already in the race. Senator Sharif Street, who is the former chair of the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania, Representative Morgan Cephas, who chairs the Philadelphia caucus in Harrisburg, and Representative Chris Robb, who represents a very kind of vote-rich area in the northwestern part of the city. So I think it was interesting that Ayla Stanford was able to enter the race with Evans' endorsement. and that Evans picked a non-lawmaker in this case. He did say in his comments about endorsing her that he was really taken by her background. She, grew up, she's actually born to, her mom was, I think, 14 years old when she had her, really relied on a lot of programs and to help her family growing up, and, became this incredible success story and has helped a lot of Philadelphians along the way. So I think that would be the congressman's explanation. I think there's also a world where maybe he didn't want to pick between three lawmakers that he has differing relationships or political histories with. And I think because he endorsed so early, you will probably see more Philadelphia lawmakers coming out. Councilwoman Cindy Bass endorsed Sharif Street this week. She was the first council member to weigh in. I think you'll see Bob Brady and the Democratic City Committee weighing in, maybe in November. So it'll be heating up, and it'll be exciting to watch a Democratic primary in Philadelphia.
And Katie, on the ballot this year in an odd number year are several judicial seats, but also 3 Supreme Court justices up for retention, which normally wouldn't get a lot of attention other than from PCN, of course. But there's been a lot of money thrown into this retention race, right?
More than you often see, yeah. So these retention elections, for anybody who doesn't know, which a lot of people don't know because they're often not very interesting, it's a yes or no question that's going to be on your ballot, and it asks you to decide whether or not you want to give a judge who's been on the court another 10 years. That's how long a term is. And so 3 judges are up this year. All were elected as Democrats in 2015. That was a huge year for the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. It had been through kind of a lot of upheaval, and that election flipped the court. Democrats have controlled it ever since. They've made some pretty big decisions about things like redistricting, elections, COVID. And so the 3 judges that are up are facing some pretty stiff opposition from Republicans who see this as their big chance to flip the court back. I should say that even if none of the judges are retained, that won't flip the court immediately. What it'll do is create vacancies that'll then be temporarily filled. And then there will be another election in 2027 to fill the seats officially. So it's a long process. But I should say, so far, the spending that we've seen in this retention race has been striking. Retention elections very, very rarely yield a vacancy. Judges almost always win them. There was only one case in 2005 where a judge did not win. So we've seen so far a consortium of PACs and nonprofits that are mostly funded by or tied to Jeffrey Yass, who is Pennsylvania's richest person. He is a prodigious Republican donor. Is very involved in pretty much any race you see in Pennsylvania, especially on the statewide level. They've been funding mailers. They've been funding digital ads. They've been doing some TV ads so far. And they're all sort of geared toward saying, hey, these judges are no good. There was one that I wrote about because it was especially striking. They claimed that the judges had drawn a gerrymandered map, and they included a picture of the map. And it looks pretty gerrymandered when you look at it on the mailer, but it's actually a map that Republicans drew in 2011 that this Democratic-controlled court actually overturned. So that was very misleading. It led to some outcry. But the long and short of it is, yeah, you're seeing a lot of communication on these races. You're seeing a good amount of spending. It's spending from a wealthy individual primarily, or again, from PACs that are associated with him. And it's going to be interesting, relatively speaking, for a retention race.
And Julia, when we talk about the elections and just the political climate in general, you wrote about a survey of younger people and how disillusioned they are with our leaders.
Yeah, this was a project by a left-leaning organization, and they conducted 2,000 conversations with college students on Pennsylvania campuses specifically. So I think Pittsburgh, Gettysburg, Dickinson, Drexel, Westchester, and I'm probably missing a few others. But what they found was somewhat grim. I think in all of those conversations, it wasn't a particularly scientific study because these were conversations, not a poll, but they found only 2% of those students believed that public officials acted in their best interest. And they kind of really dove into also the messaging that could be effective to turn this ship around a little bit, and really criticized in the end kind of the Democratic strategy in past elections to try to win Gen Z voters with maybe celebrities or a contrast to Trump, and to try to say, Gen Z voters want to hear what you're doing for them, how their situations can be made better, and they want to see how they can actually get involved in politics in a way that could have a difference. So perhaps not the most revolutionary findings, but it was a really robust research project where a lot of students weighed in on this. And I think, it's a problem for Democrats moving forward to see if they can reclaim Gen Z voters, young voters. As Gen Z shows, they're a much more independently inclined group when you look at, their voting behavior.
Christen, you also wrote about the political climate and some comments or some texts that were sent, and Governor Shapiro chimed in about using the words fascists and things like that. Talk about the political climate that we're in right now.
Sure. So what's interesting to note about Governor Josh Shapiro is that ever since he had the firebombing attack on the governor's mansion back in April, he's really become this national voice for maintaining civility in the political atmosphere, particularly as we've seen multiplying attacks that are politically and ideologically motivated. So one of the most recent examples of that would have been Jay Jones, who is a state house delegate down in Virginia. It's all over the news that the text message he sent to a Republican colleague back in 2022 were quite disturbing in that they wished that the children of a House Speaker down there would die in their mother's arms, because his feeling was that lawmakers sometimes can't change their mind on things like firearm policy unless they experience it themselves. There were some he called the children little fascists. It was really despicable behavior, and everyone on all sides agreed that was terrible rhetoric that should be set aside, because the discourse around it is not helpful. And in fact, it's making things worse. That it was very easy to agree upon that. So and Shapiro stepped in to say, he's not going to be a voice of whether in fact, he didn't comment at all on whether Jay Jones should drop out of the race there for attorney general, but he did say that this rhetoric is reprehensible and needs to stop.
All right, we're going to have to end it right there. We're out of time. Thanks to Christen Smith, Julia Terruso, and Katie Meyer for joining us on Journalist Roundtable. And thank you for watching. I'm Corey Clark. Good night.